We know societally we are reading less and less. It's almost like we've acquired to do this magical skill that we don't realise how magical it is anymore. A student I was talking to recently said that they had been doing lots and lots of reading, and when I was digging deeper into what they were reading, it was just comments on all their social media platforms. I think what we have to be really willing to ask ourselves is as a system, as a school, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And how do we know it works, or how well is it working? We have this habit of, I think, implementing unhelpful things very well and not implementing things that have real potential not well at all.
Welcome back to the Flourishing Podcast. I'm Danny Jaber, and I'm bringing us the insights, the expertise, and the stories that are driving education at the moment. Today, I'm actually joined by a very special guest who have an array of qualifications. Speech pathology, adolescent counselling, youth mental health, public health and education. I hope I haven't missed any out there. An interest in soil. And is currently completing a PhD?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, there's quite a long list there. So welcome to the podcast, Emina McLean.
Great to be here.
We were having a bit of a chat earlier on, and you were telling us a bit about your interest in soil. So I think that gives a bit of insight into what you're like as a person. So just to kind of give us that kind of foundation, where did that interest in soil start and why?
Well, really, it was a random book, but I have a very curious mind. I think that probably links quite closely to the work that I do. I like to learn, voracious learner, voracious reader, and really love paying attention to my environment.
I love it. You're here, there and everywhere, every moment of every day. And so how do you find time to balance between kind of all that work you're leveraging, but also the work you're trying to do to engage and build systems in schools? It's
a constant juggle. I think just general work-life balance, but also prioritising the work that I do. Increasingly, I'm doing more and more work with systems, and I do hold more space for that because I think it has the power to affect the most students, the most teachers, and the most school leaders. So, my priorities these days are larger scale projects that can affect, big layers of change.
Sure. And we'll dive a bit into the system thinking in the moment. I suppose part of what I want to think about as well is your kind of onus on sustainability, not only working with systems, but keeping things sustainable.
Yeah.
Where does this passion stem from?
Partly how my brain works. I'm very strategic and I'm very methodical. But one of my degrees is in public health, and I learned a lot about how systems work and how to do sort of large scale projects through that training and through existing in that space. So I think very much the way I operate now, because I'm sort of responsible for contributing to large-scale projects, but also individual schools, I take that responsibility really seriously. And so I want to be informed by the best available evidence, which is really implementation science at this point. So understanding all of this work is really a large-scale complex project that's got to have steps and processes and systems. And that, thankfully for me, aligns very well with how my brain works.
Yeah, beautiful. And how do you manage then, I suppose, with the way that research continually is being kind of revamped and there's new knowledge that comes out constantly. How do you keep up to date with that? But also how do you balance that with, I suppose, keeping the work that you've already done that's already in existence, already in ether, and kind of driving that forward still as well?
The first answer is I think that we've got enough research to do a very good job in the literacy space.
Okay.
If everybody stopped, I don't want them to, but everybody stopped researching tomorrow, I think we would be okay for a very long time.
Sure.
I think we know a lot about best bets for reading and writing with respect to assessment, curriculum, instruction. But the other part of my answer is that I don't think we can ever become totally wedded to particular approaches or ideas or practices. And I think that's been a bad habit that we've had in education, that we develop very strong affinity with or associations with particular approaches, and then we have a hard time letting them go. So things will change. Things do evolve over time. How do I stay across it? I mean, I read a lot. I like to think I've got an open mind and I want to remain nuanced. But yeah, it is that tension. I think sometimes when I'm working with schools and even with systems, I just say, no more new information. This is it. We're going with what we've got. Yeah. I don't want you to become confused or overwhelmed by new information. We just have to stop here and go on with this thinking. Yeah, it's difficult.
I guess if you're slowing down, you're a bit more partial to being receptive to what's coming through, but also knowing that the work you're doing is making some inroads as well.
Yeah.
What have been some of the successes you've seen then working with different systems? What have they done well and how's that come true?
I think we know, not just in education, there's a big gap between research and practice. And I think we've just eventually closed that gap, right? Have been enough people talking about things and advocating for things that we kind of reached a tipping point. I think that there have been countries and systems and sectors that have been brave in leading the way as well. And then all of a sudden other systems have sort of felt like, oh, we better keep up and we better make these changes as well. But I think, we've gotten to this point because there's been a willingness to accept that we probably haven't been as effective as we could have been, which has been, I think it's been really pleasing to see that tipping point occur.
Lovely. And so how's that work translated across then to what you've been doing with Max? I know you're working with our literacy space, also our assessment space. So what have you seen in that work you've done with us?
Yeah. Yes, very lucky to be working with Max. I've been with Max for a couple of years now. We've got a lot happening this year and into next year. 3 broad pieces of work that I'm doing with Max. We've done a lot of work in the assessment space. Now, that has been broadly Max's position on assessment and their vision for assessment. But I've been working across the assessment team and the literacy team to build out a revised assessment schedule. So thinking about how can we measure the effectiveness of the work that we're doing as a system, but also how can we support schools to know whether or not they're doing the job that they want to be doing. So we've done a lot of that work, and big pieces of work that have come out of that are things like the DIBELS training. So DIBELS just being a literacy assessment suite, partnered with the Department of Education and Max sort of collaboratively to then adopt the Year 1 Phonics Check within Max. So we're about to start professional learning for schools with the Year 1 Phonics Checks. Many of your schools piloted it last year, but every primary school will be doing it from this year. And something I think Max has done really well with the assessment is this very, what I would call staged and measured approach, in that we sort of stepped back and said, in 3 or 4 years' time, where would we like to be, and how can we incrementally support schools to shift their practice, rather than going, like a lot of systems have in the past, just going, oh, here are all the new tools, let's start doing them tomorrow. It's very staged, and schools have, a very generous amount of time to get used to tools and perhaps tweak or change their approach. So there's the assessment piece. We've been doing a lot of work in the phonics space. So lots of your schools have adopted phonics curricula, but many schools haven't yet or want support or guidance to do that. So a big piece of work I did with the state government was Phonics Plus, and now we're working on supporting schools in Max to use Phonics Plus as well. And then we've got a big piece of professional learning that will run over a couple of years in the writing space. So a lot of people know Mac's vision for instruction, but they don't know that within that there's the vision for reading and there's the vision for writing. So a lot of schools have reported that they've got clarity more on the reading component now because of the partnership with OCA, but they don't have a clear sense of the balance between, for example, sentence and grammar instruction or paragraph instruction or genre instruction. So we're running sort of practice-embedded, sustained long-term professional learning to build knowledge for writing as well. So we're about to kick off with that as well.
Amazing. There's so much within that catalogue. And so what are the benefits then for not only the schools but the system, I suppose, bringing everyone together on board in the same consistent direction then?
There's been a lot of work that I've done with the literacy team and then the assessment team to sort of build knowledge within Max. I sort of see the work that I do when I partner with sectors or systems as I should be, making myself redundant. So I want systems to be very, very expert. So there's capacity building within Max. But yes, I think that's where we're getting to now, is that no matter where you go to school within Max, that you'll have a pretty comparable educational experience. And even within the same school, there might be 5 grade 1 classes, but it doesn't really matter which of those grade 1 classes that you're in, you're going to have a pretty comparable experience. And there's always going to be, and I think there should be, variations between teachers, variations between delivery, but the core offering that we have is something that is really high quality and can close those achievement gaps. So we're trying to resource teachers with really high quality resources, build knowledge, and build understanding of what sort of sustainable, consistent practices can be.
You've written in the past, I think you termed it this idea of a pendulum swing. What does that mean for a system and schools that are involved in this sort of work?
We've had a habit of that in education over many, many years of, I think something that's really a good example at the moment is tech, right? Every classroom needed tech for everything. And now we're saying, let's ban phones, let's get off digital devices, tech's really bad. And we're just very good at going from one extreme to the other. In literacy, it was whole language, and then it was balanced literacy, and now a term that I think is pretty problematic, but we don't need to talk about that, structured literacy. But I think with every pendulum swing, the more kind of extreme it is, the harder it is to get people on board anyway, because they've just gone through so many cycles of change. But the risk is when you swing the other way too, that you don't really know how far you should go, right? And examples of that now are, I mean, I think phonics is still very underdone in many schools, but it is also being overdone in many schools. We didn't teach sentence level writing and grammar for many years, which was a problem, but now I would say we've gone in some contexts too far, and that's being overdone. So I think what we have to be really willing to ask ourselves is as a system, as a school, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And how do we know it works, or how well is it working? And be really, I think, cautious, and a healthy degree of, I think, criticism is useful to protect ourselves against, in the past, I think, decisions that haven't been very well thought out.
Sure.
And we ironically have this habit of, I think, implementing probably unhelpful things very well and not implementing things that have real potential not well at all.
Yeah. I guess the wariness there for schools and leaders is you don't want to keep driving something that's not necessarily working for your community.
Yes. Yeah. And change for change's sake is not a good idea. We want to be really intentional and purposeful.
Okay. We'll move on then to maybe dive into a little bit more, then think about literacy itself. You've got a history of working in schools in Melbourne, and Docklands Primary was your most recent venture. What did that experience bring for you in terms of your kind of work with schools generally across the systems? What sort of empathy is that does it continue to give you for teachers who are at the coalface?
My career was very interesting because I started out in primary schools and then secondary schools, and then sort of zoomed out and also worked across sectors, and then entered academia, and then went back to Docklands, and I'm still there. I think being on the ground is a very useful lens, particularly when I work so much with systems, big networks of schools, and then also other schools. I think for me, I couldn't turn down the opportunity back in 2020 when it arose, because it was the chance to set up a school in a way that I thought could bring together all of my research knowledge and my practice knowledge and really test out what can work best.
Sure.
So understanding and learning the real challenge and difficulties and how slow and laborious that work is, and how you have to be deliberate and methodical year after year after year. Having walked in those shoes, it helps me really understand how hard it is for other leaders or teachers to make those changes and what it takes. And I think understanding also that just because we've got something in a research project finding, it's not as simple or as linear as just going, well, let's go and do that in practice. There's nuance, and every school context is different, and there's things you've got to figure out, and there's always going to be trade-offs. And I think existing in that more nuanced space between research and practice has been very helpful for me.
Do you have any advice then for teachers that are on the receiving end of changes?
Yeah.
And then we'll take you out of Emina McLean, who's working with systems, Emina McLean, who's Docklands primary teacher. What's that experience like? And do you have any advice for teachers that are maybe struggling with kind of the onslaught? It can feel like an onslaught sometimes of change that's going on around them.
Teachers just, I think, cop it all the time.
Yeah.
They cop it in the media when it's, I don't know, NAPLAN results are out. They cop it for all sorts of things. Really, I see implementation as a leadership responsibility. I don't think it's the responsibility of individual teachers. I think leaders are tasked with understanding how we're going to do this in our school and slowly, strategically supporting teachers to do that. As individual teachers, when it feels like it's too much or it's too fast or it's an onslaught, I would kind of counter that with saying it's probably a leadership issue. And there's probably not enough thinking or planning or support for teachers. It should feel like we're working on these things because, and we have this shared rationale and this shared vision, and I can see what it can look like, and I'm being given an appropriate amount of time to implement it. I think, we've got a problem with either systems or school leadership when teachers feel that pressure.
You should feel, it should
feel supported.
It should feel attainable as well, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. That makes sense. Sorry, I said I was going to talk about literacy, and then I got sidetracked by the point you made.
I think it's really important though, because I think teaching is a job that is so pressured and challenging anyway. And any time a leader asks a teacher to change even one thing, it's extraordinarily difficult to do. And I think leaders who often are not actually having to do any of the things they're proposing, teachers have to do that. It's easy to lose sight of what that load is when you're passing it on. And I think that's a really critical consideration if we want things to be, realistic and sustainable.
I'm going to quote you again. Phonics is the most important, least important thing. What do you mean?
Some people don't like it when I say this because they think phonics is very important, and I also think phonics is very important. I think when we've been talking about literacy reform, phonics has gotten all the airspace, and we've neglected to talk about a lot of the other really important things. By saying phonics is the most important, least important thing, I think we acknowledge that it's critical, but it's access to literacy. Very basic access to literacy. Even for word level reading and spelling, there's a lot more to it than just teaching phonics, right?
Sure.
We have to teach morphology. We have to teach students to read words that have multiple syllables. We have to start getting them reading connected text and building their fluency and so on. So I think it is so critical, but it's also the most important, least important thing in terms of time allocation in a timetable. I don't want to see phonics lessons that go for an hour. We don't need a phonics lesson that goes for an hour and so on. So I think it's that proportion of things, understanding it's essential, but it's one essential ingredient amongst many.
I suppose off that point then, what is the role then of something like oral language in terms of reading acquisition? If we're looking at how, that kind of growth from being able to speak verbally to being able to read, what does that look like in that space?
Oral language is critical, and we have a lot of research that says that it's fundamental to reading development and writing development because it's all language, right? And we know that some students come to school with different levels of oral language, and it might be because of their environment. It might be because they're, acquiring English as an additional language, but a very solid foundation in terms of understanding the structure of language, meaning of language, and use of language is really, really essential.
And that obviously flares up in different ways for schools that are in different locales with different communities. I guess the notion there is that there's a similarity regardless of a student's background, that oral language, and regardless of the capacity to speak it at home, is still a foundation point for reading acquisition. Is that am I understanding that right? We can cut this out if I've got that wrong.
No. Oral language is a critical foundation. I think something that is really worth talking about, though, and understanding that different students bring different oral language skills for a range of reasons. But also once you're starting to learn to read and write, oral language and its value or utility shifts in that. I think an unhelpful debate has been for years, and Trina Spencer, a very well-known researcher in this space, but other academics talk about this too. This idea that we've talked about language, oral language, as being biologically primary and reading as being biologically secondary, I think it's very unhelpful as a distinction. Because when you come to school, language, spoken language, and even the language that you're listening to is academic, right? It doesn't follow the conventions of everyday talking. The structure is very different. So the language that we're trying to build when students come to school, and the language that's going to feed forward to making them better readers and better writers, is what we would call more academic language, with different vocabulary, different sentence structure, different conventions. So oral language, really essential foundation, and students, especially in the early years who have stronger oral language, are likely to be better comprehenders of text. But unless we start to build the more sophisticated language, you'll kind of see that plateau as well.
Sure. And that's kind of the language of power, right? That's the desirable
the language of books, the language of power, and so on. Yeah.
What sort of advice then do you have for teachers that are navigating a world with English as an additional language students, or now as we kind of move through MTSS and navigating that? It's a difficult field naturally with those layers in as well. It makes it even more complicated.
Yeah, and I think this is probably why individual contexts are important. I know at my school we have a very, very high proportion of students learning English as an additional language. And so that means that probably as compared to other schools, the emphasis that we put on building oral language and then that very supported transition from sort of everyday speaking and listening to more formal language structures, we would teach more of that than we would if we're in a school where students weren't learning English as an additional language. So in that case, you need to know your students, and I think you need to have really good practices in place to identify when they come to you what they need. So for example, we screen oral language and we get a really good sense right from the start of prep what students need, and we track that through. And we do a lot more explicit teaching of things that probably other students might acquire more incidentally. But we have this real emphasis on teaching vocabulary very explicitly, teaching sentence structure very explicitly, very language and text-rich environments. So we're sort of flooding students day after day with language, so it looks a little bit different. So I think knowing your students and knowing your context is really important. And then the broader MTSS structures too, I think as individual teachers, the only thing that there's really control over is tier 1 practices.
Yes.
So again, the bigger piece of how well are our students doing, or what supports are they getting, or are they getting the right supports, is a school leadership piece and building out structures beyond what individual teachers can control.
What sort of things then do schools need in place? What are the non-negotiables? So if one factor is strong leadership in terms of the pedagogy to help with the tier 1 practices, is there anything else that's a non-negotiable for schools to help those students succeed?
I think because I've done this work for so long in individual schools and my own school, I've got, I don't know if it's a blueprint, but I think every school is different, but I've got a good sense of the most effective levers. Now, the first one is, yes, like you say, effective leadership and principals who really see teaching and learning as their core business. I don't see schools being highly, highly effective sort of year after year after year unless they've got a leadership group that really can sweat that detail. Primary versus secondary is a little bit different. Primary schools, I would say, non-negotiables are real attention to those foundational literacy skills as early as possible and nailing things like phonics and fluency in the early years and ensuring students have really good access to broader literacy, comprehension and writing. Really well articulated decisions around curriculum resourcing, assessment tools, assessment curriculum alignment, and understanding that sort of leadership of assessment and curriculum and pedagogy are 3 very different things. It's not just that we're doing literacy or we're doing phonics. Well, how are we going to assess it? Are the ways in which we're assessing it connecting to the ways in which we're teaching it? Okay, if this is the curriculum resource that we're using, how are we going to support our teachers to get better at that? Understanding those connections between assessment, curriculum, and pedagogy are really critical. Understanding the importance of high-quality resources, high-quality curriculum is critically important. And I think something else that we haven't been good at that we're probably getting better at is just reading and writing volume. Rich, complex text, reading a lot every day, writing a lot every day, and making time for that, because you can have really high quality planning and high quality teaching, but if students aren't experiencing that volume of instruction, we've got another problem.
Do you have any advice on that point then, maybe for teachers that are struggling to ignite that passion in some of their students to do the reading? Is there, I know there's no kind of switch that you can flick to inspire, but is there anything that schools and teachers can be doing to try and inspire students broadly?
I can't remember who came up with this term. This idea that a really rich, say, English curriculum has a balance of mirror and window. So we read a lot of texts where students can see themselves, but we also read a lot of texts and study a lot of topics where students can learn to think outside of themselves and think of others. If you think to the curriculum resourcing piece that Max is doing in terms of the text students are reading and the topics they're studying and so on, that's what you're sort of trying to achieve, right? Students, generally speaking, love to learn. So how kind of interesting is the content? And this links back to your vision for instruction too. Like, how engaged are students in their learning? How much teacher-student back and forth is actually going on? How much are students getting to kind of participate as opposed to being sort of passive recipients? But when it comes to reading, the habit of reading is actually this complex combination of my skill, my self-concept as a reader, and what people in my environment model to me.
Yes.
Right? So do my parents or caregivers model that reading is important? Does my teacher model that reading is important? But also, do I have the skills and runs on the board, the reading success, to feel like that's a thing that I can approach? But also, have I been in classrooms and with teachers where they have shown me that reading is super purposeful and there's something to get from reading? I can get this really rich product that allows me to be a really good thinker or allows me to form an opinion and so on. So students who are not motivated to read usually don't have the skill, don't have the stamina because there just hasn't been enough reading, and or reading hasn't been modelled to them as being critically important. And it's often those 3 things coming together. So often we talk about adolescents, for example, in secondary, don't want to read. Now, it's often that, it's skill, it's stamina, but it's often we've had this habit of really bringing texts down to the students. So they're reading very, very simple texts that are just dead boring and not very motivating themselves. So this idea of setting a high bar with rich, ambitious texts as well that are going to broaden students' thinking can be helpful.
There's this kind of growing fear that we've got this so much short form content surrounding us now.
Yes.
That goes for reading videos as well, of course, YouTube, social media. So the impact that's having on the cognitive capacity of students versus the desire to try and get them to read longer and longer texts.
Yes.
There's a real tussle there, particularly in senior years, as you mentioned.
Yes. This is a real concern of mine. I think we know societally we are reading less and less. Across every single age bracket that gets surveyed, we are reading less and less. So that's a problem. It's almost like we've acquired to do this magical skill that we don't realise how magical it is anymore. And the internet, it's the same with knowledge, right? We can Google anything in an instant, so knowledge has been devalued. We don't actually understand how magical knowledge is. This is why I really support restricting tech in the classroom, because we have to build students' capacity to stay with texts for longer periods. I think that's why a really well-articulated timetable in primary and secondary is really important. We don't know exactly how much comprehension instruction is the right amount, but most experts say that we probably should be doing at least 30 minutes a day in the primary years, which means time with text. Now, in the early years, I think reading a high volume of texts is really important. So read lots and lots and lots of short texts. But as students get older, I think we should be reading less texts that are longer to teach them how to stay with texts for longer. So I think our curriculum choices, and you've got this reflected in, the Max English curriculum now, is lots of novels, lots of longer texts, lots of really, challenging, ambitious texts that are going to build that capacity to stay with texts and do that sort of deeper thinking. But stamina is such a problem, even for skilled readers, and you'll see outcomes really, plateau or decline if you're not applying those skills. So, yes, less short form. A student I was talking to recently said that they had been doing lots and lots of reading, and when I was digging deeper into what they were reading, it was just comments on all their social media platforms. Now, literally, that is reading, isn't it? But is that going to boost your comprehension? No. Yeah. Are you reading really suitably complex texts? Are you reading a range of texts? Are you reading long form texts? That's not, I don't know, what is reading? That's a philosophical question, but curriculum choices, critically important. Rich, ambitious text, critically important, but protect a time to read a lot in primary and secondary. Ironically, we don't do a lot of reading in secondary or writing, and that's a real problem. They report to me all the time, teachers and leaders in secondary, that curriculum is so busy and there's curriculum pressures. But for me, in English at least, I think we have to see texts as the curriculum. Protect it. Reading and then writing as ways of kind of expressing our experiences with text. But volume plus complexity is the sweet spot.
It feels like there's this real rich transition taking place now with primary schools and the research and the science behind early years reading and writing. What happens to that as we do go through the secondary years? And as you say there is sometimes a lack of quality curriculum that goes with secondary English. What should secondary schools be wary of, I suppose, then, as they try and plan around that?
I think it's the way sort of curriculum has been interpreted or superimposed over the years. I don't know. That's just my view. If we're not reading in English, like, what is English? If we're not writing in English, what is English? There's a real thought that primary and secondary are very different, and they currently are. But I think the only thing that changes as we move through the years of schooling, and people often talk about this in sort of prep to 2 versus 3 to 6 as well, as if they're completely different entities. The only thing that shifts is we de-emphasise foundational literacy skills as they're acquired, right? Sure. So phonics then becomes spelling. And then when spelling is acquired or taught, well, we kind of remove that and we just teach spelling in the context of teaching vocabulary in secondary. But I think for secondaries, and I do a lot of work in the secondary space in both systems and partnering with individual schools, I think the things to be most aware of is that, if we don't read and if we don't write, we're not going to get reading or writing growth, even for our most proficient students. So being really thoughtful about, and not just in English, this can't just sit in English, it's cross-discipline. Then we have to think about disciplinary literacy. How much are we reading and writing across the day, across subjects? And are students equipped to meet that challenge as well? Because what we're finding, this is across systems, across the country, a lot of students, particularly in year 7 and 8, are not equipped to access text at a year 7 or 8 level. Sure. They're missing decoding knowledge or they're missing fluency skills and so on. So I think recipes for success in secondary are good screening practices for year 7 and 8, which is what, Max is working toward with the DIBELS assessment suite. Can we capture fluency problems when students enter secondary and resolve those, but really thoughtful text selection, text volume, and trying to ensure that we write as much as we can, teach vocab as much as we can across the curriculum as well.
Sure. You make a really pertinent point there about that transition phase as well, because I was an English teacher, a secondary English teacher, but I think to my own detriment, I didn't have the expertise of a primary teacher. So I found when I was identifying students that maybe didn't have the same language capacity, writing capacity, I didn't have the skill set either to fix it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a common issue, but it's definitely something that I felt when I was teaching.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And I think that's secondary training, right? Secondary training is you learn about your subject, you learn about your domain. You don't necessarily learn about teaching, reading and writing.
No.
Now, I think that's important. It's not just that we're interested in closing gaps and catching students up. Disciplinary literacy is important even in schools where you might have the top performers, right? We still have to, if I'm a teacher of secondary science, my students are not going to magically be great at comprehending dense science texts unless I teach them how to do that and we have a lot of practice. It's the same if I'm a history teacher or a psychology teacher. Part of teaching my discipline is teaching them how to read and write in that discipline. And those skills don't just magically transfer from English. And I think we're only just kind of wrestling with that now.
We've obviously got this real desire to drive independent understanding, independent learning, independent reading. What skills and knowledge do we need to continue to drive through fluency that will help writing in post-early years then? So just really nailing into some of what you've talked about.
Yeah, and I think this probably links back to your vision for instruction, this idea of gradual release. And we often think about the instructional hierarchy here. It's not that the curriculum changes per se. I still think good English teaching or a good English curriculum is lots of reading and lots of writing and lots of speaking and lots of listening. Yeah. But what changes is kind of who's doing the greatest amount of work. And we're transitioning the responsibility from, if you think about a prep classroom or a grade 1 classroom, in a comprehension lesson, who's doing the reading? The teacher is doing the reading. But at some point, and often from sort of grade 2 onward, you can start getting students to incrementally take on bits of text themselves. So it might be you're reading together. And at some point, you can start to get students taking on bits of text independently, as long as you kind of manage how that's done and that it's sort of accountable and rigorous. So it's the same probably from primary into secondary. You got to really think about, well, how can I push students to be doing more and more without me, but at the same time, how can I check that they're being successful?
Yes.
So if I'm releasing them to read independently, am I checking that they've actually comprehended that text? How am I doing that? How often am I doing that?
And how am I responding to that?
Because sometimes in secondary, we think reading is just assigning reading or do it at home. Whereas I think if there's text in our subjects, we are responsible for checking whether students are comprehending those texts in our subjects. Sure. Writing is a bit different because I think what changes is the length and complexity. And so you might be having a real focus on sentence level writing and spelling in the early years, and then you're starting to introduce perhaps paragraphs and then genre. So then the questions are, well, which genres, where do they best sit, in which subjects and so on. And that's from primary to secondary as well, is the overall kind of quantity and proportion of things. But I think it's gradual release, instructional hierarchy, and sort of quantity and proportion of what we're teaching.
This is how I end each of the podcasts, Emina. I want to position you now back into the mode of being a teacher, as you are, and this idea that I've only got, I'm really busy, as you know. Teachers are really busy. I'm planning. I'm having to respond to issues in my classroom. So I've only got 30 minutes spare next week. What are you directing me to do with that 30 minutes?
I've got so many ideas about this for leaders and for teachers. Teachers, I think, if you were lucky enough to have 30 minutes free,
yeah, you have to be lucky.
I would go and watch somebody in my school teach something that I was trying to get better at.
Right. Why?
Because I think worked examples are really valuable. So I would do that. Or I might go, I've got 30 minutes. I'm going to go to 3 teachers who I know are super experienced in really nailing phonics, or they're really nailing vocabulary, or they're really nailing a read aloud, or they're really nailing teaching persuasive writing. I'm going to go and watch them and try and find some time to chat about that. The other thing is, if the 30 minutes was sprinkled across the week, wouldn't that be even more magical? Like you had 5 minutes extra a day or something. I'd be finding time to do some sort of intensive catch-up reading instruction with students who need it most. But if I was a leader with that time, I would be, again, I think being in classrooms is the most valuable thing you can do.
Yeah.
The drop-in, as long as you've set that really supportive, warm culture that the drop-in is okay. But I think for leaders, if you ever have spare time, when you're dropping into classrooms, you're not evaluating teacher practice per se, you're evaluating your effectiveness as a leader.
Yeah.
So I think that's a habit that I've built, is when I'm at school, I get into as many classrooms as often as I can to say, is this being led well? Do our teachers need more support from us? What could we be doing kind of better or differently? Or are things looking really, consistent and everything's running as it is, so let's keep doing those things. So, but yeah, the power of peer observation, I think, through the leader lens or teacher lens is great use of time, always.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear.
You never regret going to watch someone teach.
No, and I think there's something we're really pushing ourselves this year. We're working very closely with Tom Sherrington and walkthroughs and the walkthroughs coaching, and the idea of having an eye on your classrooms, but cultivating a culture where it's normalised to drop in, and to focus on the learning, and what's going on with the learning, not the teachers, nothing judgmental, but how's the learning going in that classroom?
And visibility of leaders, I think, is so important. It's back to my point earlier that highly effective schools that achieve and sustain impact have leaders who are visible and show that they're deeply invested in teaching and learning, and that's a really simple, habitual way that we can show that.
Superb. All right, last question. We've heard a lot about you, what's inspired you. We've heard a lot about, the research you're doing, how you're working with systems. So beyond that then, who or what is inspiring your work most at the moment?
I'm just generally like a very optimistic, excited person. So I'd say I'm fairly easily inspired. The things that I would say inspire me the most are highly effective schools and highly effective school leaders that are really determined to achieve the best in their context, but they're inspirational for me because they give us more examples of what's possible. I'm getting inspiration through partnerships like I have with Max. I've got partnerships with the Victorian government and the Tassie state government. I'm just constantly inspired by what's possible, what's next. Like, we've achieved that, great, what can we do next? But I think I'm also inspired more broadly in education. I'm inspired by people who are brave enough to kind of think for themselves and not really just sort of follow whatever the dominant discourse is, and really be willing to be open to learning and challenge things that they think are not particularly helpful as well. So people who are really open to deep reflection and challenge, I'm inspired by that. I think there's also, I read a lot, I listen to a lot of podcasts. There's lots of researchers that I think are very kind of measured and nuanced, and I really, I'm constantly kind of inspired by their work as well.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Emina. I say this graciously. You've managed to lead us through the thinking of a system. You've been really considerate of what leaders go through, and I think most importantly as well, as I mentioned earlier on, those that are at the coalface, those that are having to initiate and implement all of this work, the teachers, that real empathy for what they're going through. And I think those insights that you provided are not only useful to us, but just give us that kind of grounding that, the work has implications, and we've got to be considerate of so many people with it around us. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed today's episode, you know what to do. Please give us a like. Please ensure that you subscribe to our Flourishing Learners page on YouTube. Plenty of resources online on our Kevin page as well, situated around literacy itself, assessment, the documentation that supports those initiatives, and some learning modules surrounding other aspects of teaching that were covered today, things like gradual release of responsibility, and other stuff as well. So you can find all of that on Kevin amongst our teaching and learning page. Please jump on that, explore it, and try to take more away from so much of what we can do together as a system. And lastly, of course, if you do want to make contact with us, if you have any suggestions for future episodes, if you want us to drop into your school and share and leverage some of what you're doing in light of what Emina shared today, please write into us at podcast@max.vic.edu.au. Give us a shout out and we'll happily get back to you. So until next time, keep flourishing.